Welcome to the Sleepy Scholar, where curious minds drift off to fascinating facts and the world's greatest mysteries. Tonight, we'll journey into one of the most legendary places on Earth, the Bermuda Triangle. A place where ships have vanished, aircraft have disappeared, and generations have wondered whether the truth lies beneath the waves, or somewhere beyond our understanding. So settle in, relax, and let your curiosity drift with the tide. This is the Sleepy Scholar. Let's begin, gently, with where this stretch of ocean actually is, because even that turns out to be less fixed than the legend suggests. There is no official boundary for the Bermuda Triangle. No government, no maritime authority, no scientific body has ever formally defined its edges. What most people picture is a rough triangle connecting 3 points: Miami, Florida, in the west, the islands of Bermuda, far out in the Atlantic to the north, and Puerto Rico to the south, enclosing something like 500,000 to 1,000,000 square miles of open ocean, depending on whose map you're looking at. It's one of the busiest stretches of water and sky on the entire planet, crossed daily by commercial shipping lanes, private boats, and countless commercial and private flights. Millions of vessels and aircraft pass through it safely every single year. It's worth holding that thought quietly, right at the start, before we go any further into the stranger parts of the story. The name itself is newer than you might expect. The phrase Bermuda Triangle was coined in 1964 by a writer named Vincent Gaddis in an article for Argosy magazine titled The Deadly Bermuda Triangle. Gaddis pulled together a handful of earlier disappearances, gave the region a name, and the legend, in the form most people recognize today, was essentially born in that one article less than a lifetime ago. Before 1964, sailors had their own older, scattered names and superstitions about parts of this water, but the triangle itself, as a defined, feared shape on the map, is a relatively modern invention. Let your breathing settle here a moment. In and out, there's nothing you need to navigate tonight. Just resting at the edge of the water. One of the earliest disappearances often folded into the legend happened decades before the name existed at all. In March of 1918, a United States Navy collier, a large ship built to carry coal, called the USS Cyclops, departed from Barbados carrying over 300 crew and passengers, along with a heavy cargo of manganese ore bound for Baltimore. It never arrived. No wreckage was ever found. No distress signal was ever received. To this day, it remains one of the largest single losses of life in United States naval history outside of direct combat, and officially, the cause of its disappearance has never been determined. Storms, structural failure under an unusually heavy and unfamiliar cargo, and even wartime sabotage have all been proposed over the years. None have ever been confirmed. It remains honestly and simply unsolved. That single loss might have stayed a quiet historical footnote, if not for what happened decades later, in an incident that would become the single most famous case in the entire legend. On December 5, 1945, 5 Navy torpedo bombers, a formation known as Flight 19, departed from a base in Fort Lauderdale, Florida, on a routine overwater training exercise. 14 airmen were aboard the 5 aircraft. Partway through the flight, the formation's leader, radioing back to base, reported that his compass instruments were behaving strangely, and that the formation was uncertain of its position. Radio transmissions grew increasingly confused over the following hours, describing water that didn't look right and uncertainty about which direction led back to land. And then the transmissions simply stopped. A search and rescue seaplane, a Martin Mariner carrying 13 crew, was dispatched that same evening to look for them. It too disappeared, with no confirmed distress call. In total, 27 men vanished in a single afternoon, and despite one of the largest search efforts in Navy history at the time, no confirmed wreckage from any of the 6 aircraft was ever recovered. The Navy's own official investigation into Flight 19 attributed the loss primarily to navigational error, compounded by deteriorating weather and the specific, known unreliability of the compasses in that model of aircraft under certain conditions, along with the disorienting nature of open ocean flying at dusk with no clear horizon. The Mariner seaplane sent to search for them, separately, had a documented history within the fleet of fuel vapor buildup that made it prone to sudden, catastrophic explosion. A mechanical vulnerability entirely unrelated to anything happening with Flight 19 itself, but tragically possible given the circumstances of that same evening. 2 separate, plausible, thoroughly investigated explanations, layered unfortunately on top of each other, in the same afternoon, in the same stretch of ocean. It's a devastating loss of 27 lives either way. But it is not, according to the official record, an unexplained one. Here's something worth sitting with for a moment, because it changes the shape of the entire legend once you know it. In 1975, a research librarian and writer named Larry Kusch published a book called The Bermuda Triangle Mystery, solved after spending years tracking down the original source material, actual insurance records, newspaper archives, and official reports, behind dozens of the region's most famous, unexplained disappearances. What he found again and again was a pattern of exaggeration and error compounding through retelling. Ships reported lost without a trace had sometimes actually been found, their wreckage simply never mentioned in later retellings of the story. Storms present at the time of a loss were sometimes quietly omitted from later accounts, making a straightforward maritime disaster sound inexplicable decades later. Dates, locations, and even the number of people aboard a vessel occasionally shifted slightly with each new book or article that repeated the story, small distortions accumulating over years until an ordinary loss read as a genuine impossibility. It's worth knowing, too, what the people who actually insure ships and aircraft think about all of this, since they have every financial incentive to know the real risk involved. Lloyd's of London, one of the world's oldest and most established insurance markets, has stated publicly on more than one occasion that it does not charge higher premiums for vessels traveling through the Bermuda Triangle than it does for any other comparably trafficked stretch of ocean. The United States Coast Guard, which maintains extensive records of maritime search and rescue operations, has said much the same, that the region does not show a statistically higher rate of unexplained loss compared to other heavily used areas of ocean with similarly unpredictable weather. One last thought before we close this first segment, and it's worth holding on to as we continue through the rest of tonight's journey together. None of this means nothing strange has ever happened in these waters. It means simply that the water itself carries an unusually heavy weight of storytelling, layered on top of an unusually busy, unusually storm-prone stretch of ocean, and untangling exactly how much of the legend is mystery, and how much is simply the sea being the sea, is going to take us the rest of the night to properly walk through. The very first recorded account of anything unusual in this stretch of water may belong to Christopher Columbus. Crossing the region in 1492, his own ship's log describes a strange, dancing light on the distant horizon one night, and separately, unusual behavior from his compass, which appeared to drift from true north in a way his crew found unsettling. He recorded both observations plainly, without dramatic explanation, simply as strange things noticed during a long and uncertain voyage. It's a remarkable thought to sit with. The very same waters people still write books about today were already producing strange stories over 500 years ago, long before Flight 19, long before the name Bermuda Triangle existed in anyone's mind at all. As it turns out, Columbus's compass observation has a real, well-understood scientific explanation, one that sailors and navigators have studied carefully for centuries since. A compass doesn't actually point toward true geographic north. It points toward magnetic north, which sits in a slightly different location, and the difference between the two, called magnetic declination, varies depending on exactly where on Earth you're standing. Remarkably, the Bermuda Triangle happens to sit in one of a small handful of places on the entire planet where, for a period of time, true north and magnetic north align almost perfectly, meaning the usual correction sailors needed to make simply wasn't necessary there. For an experienced, prepared navigator, this was simply a known regional quirk, easily accounted for. For anyone unfamiliar with the area, expecting the same correction they'd need anywhere else, it could genuinely produce a confusing, disorienting drift in their heading. Not a supernatural force acting on the compass, but a real, mapped, entirely explainable difference in how the compass needed to be read in that particular part of the world. Running directly through the heart of this region is one of the most powerful ocean currents on the entire planet. The Gulf Stream, a fast-moving river of warm water flowing north along the eastern coast of the United States before curving out across the Atlantic. It moves swiftly, often faster than 4 miles an hour, strong enough to noticeably push a drifting vessel far from where it was last seen in a surprisingly short amount of time. It's also capable of contributing to sudden, sharp changes in weather, as warm water meets cooler air and produces fast-forming storms with little advance warning. A current this strong doesn't just move water. It can quietly scatter wreckage and debris across a wide enough area that searchers looking in the wrong place, even by a matter of hours, might reasonably find nothing at all. Here's a phenomenon that, remarkably, science itself took a long time to fully accept as real. For generations, sailors told stories of massive sudden waves, towering walls of water appearing seemingly from nowhere, capable of overwhelming even a large, well-built ship in moments. For a long time, many oceanographers considered these accounts folklore, statistically implausible according to standard wave models. Then, in 1995, a wave measuring over 80 feet was directly recorded by scientific instruments at an oil platform called Dropner in the North Sea, finally providing hard, undeniable data confirming that so-called rogue waves are entirely real. They remain difficult to predict, and they represent a genuinely plausible, purely natural explanation for at least some historical losses at sea, in the Bermuda Triangle and in dangerous waters anywhere else in the world. One of the more popular scientific theories proposed specifically for this region involves the ocean floor itself. Large deposits of methane hydrate, a naturally occurring ice-like substance that traps methane gas within its structure, do genuinely exist beneath parts of the Atlantic seabed, including areas within the triangle. Some researchers have proposed that a sudden, large release of this trapped gas could dramatically reduce the density of the water above it, theoretically causing a ship floating on the surface to lose buoyancy and sink with unusual speed, while a related release into the air above could, in theory, affect an aircraft's engines or lift. It's important to say clearly, while methane hydrate deposits are real, and small releases have been observed, no specific historical shipwreck in the region has ever been definitively linked to this exact mechanism. and many oceanographers remain genuinely skeptical that a release large enough to sink a large vessel has actually occurred in the area within recorded history. A real geological phenomenon, attached to a theory that remains, so far, unproven rather than confirmed. The ocean floor beneath this region also happens to include some of the deepest water in the entire Atlantic Ocean. The Puerto Rico Trench, running along part of the triangle's southern edge, plunges to depths of over 27,000 feet in places. Deep enough that recovering wreckage, even with today's most advanced underwater technology, remains genuinely difficult and in some cases essentially impossible. It's worth holding this fact alongside every "no wreckage was ever found" detail in tonight's stories. Sometimes that isn't mysterious at all. One last thought before we close this segment, and it's a simple meteorological one. This particular stretch of the Atlantic sits well within one of the most active hurricane corridors in the entire Western Hemisphere. Historical storm tracking data confirms the region experiences a genuinely higher frequency of tropical storms and hurricanes than many other heavily trafficked ocean areas. A real, measurable, entirely natural pattern of severe weather passing through with real regularity. Sudden squalls, fast-building tropical systems, and the general unpredictability of open Atlantic weather were shaping the fate of ships and aircraft in this exact stretch of water for centuries, long before anyone thought to look for a stranger explanation. Sometimes it's simply a very large, very dark, very deep piece of ocean, doing exactly what deep water anywhere in the world does to anything lost within it. Not every mystery in this stretch of ocean involves something that vanished completely. Some of the strangest stories are about the ones that were found, just not the way anyone expected. In December of 1872, a ship called the Mary Celeste was discovered adrift in the Atlantic, sails still partially set, entirely seaworthy, her cargo of industrial alcohol still largely intact in the hold. There was no sign of struggle, no distress written anywhere aboard. And there was no one on her at all. The captain, his wife, their young daughter, and the entire crew had simply vanished, along with the ship's one lifeboat, as though they had calmly stepped off the side of a perfectly functional vessel and never returned. It's worth pausing on something important here. The Mary Celeste was actually found near the Azores, off the coast of Portugal, thousands of miles from the Bermuda Triangle's usual boundaries. It's been folded into the legend so many times over the decades that most retellings simply place it there anyway. A small but telling example of how a genuinely eerie story can drift, geographically, into whichever larger legend seems to fit it best. As for what actually happened to her crew, the leading theory among maritime historians involves fumes from the alcohol cargo, enough to cause the captain to fear an imminent explosion, prompting him to move everyone into the lifeboat as a precaution, likely still tethered to the ship, only for that line to break in rough seas, leaving the lifeboat and everyone aboard it lost at sea while the Mary Celeste sailed on, empty without them. We spoke earlier about the USS Cyclops, lost without explanation in 1918. Here's a detail that rarely makes it into the shorter versions of that story, and it changes the shape of the mystery considerably. The Cyclops had two sister ships, built to the same design and used for the same purpose, the Proteus and the Nereus. In 1941, more than 2 decades after the Cyclops vanished, both of these sister ships were also lost at sea, on similar routes, carrying similarly heavy loads of metallic ore. 3 ships from the exact same design, lost under strikingly similar circumstances decades apart. Naval historians and engineers who've studied the pattern point to a far more grounded explanation than anything supernatural. Evidence suggests this particular class of collier ship may have had a structural vulnerability to catastrophic failure when carrying unusually dense, heavy cargo like ore, a design flaw capable of causing a ship to break apart and sink far faster than a crew could ever send a distress call. Not a cursed stretch of water. Possibly simply a flawed blueprint, tested 3 times in 3 different decades, with the same tragic result each time. Here's a case that remains, honestly, still quite mysterious even now. In January of 1921, a 5-masted schooner called the Carroll A. Deering was found run hard aground on Diamond Shoals, off the coast of North Carolina. The ship itself was in reasonably good condition. Food had been prepared in the galley, as though the crew had been going about an ordinary day right up until the moment they weren't. But every single crew member was gone, along with the lifeboats and the ship's navigational papers. Investigators at the time considered piracy, mutiny, and even involvement in illegal rum running during Prohibition, since the timing and location made smuggling activity plausible in the area. To this day, no definitive answer has ever been confirmed. Unlike several of tonight's other stories, this one hasn't actually been solved. It remains genuinely an open case. An earlier disappearance, predating even the Cyclops by over a century, occasionally gets folded into this same legend as well. In December of 1813, Theodosia Burr Alston, daughter of the former Vice President Aaron Burr, boarded a ship called the Patriot in South Carolina, intending to sail to New York to reunite with her father. The ship never arrived, and no wreckage was ever conclusively identified. Historical weather records confirm a severe storm moved through the region around the same time, offering a straightforward, plausible explanation on its own. The ship's actual route only partially overlaps with where the modern Bermuda Triangle is usually drawn, another case of a genuinely sad, genuinely unsolved historical loss, retroactively absorbed into a legend that wouldn't exist as a named concept for another 150 years. Not every story in this legend, it's worth knowing plainly, is even based on a real event at all. One of the most frequently repeated tales involves a ship called the Ellen Austin, said to have encountered a derelict, crewless vessel drifting in the Triangle sometime in the 1880s. According to the popular version, the Ellen Austin's captain placed some of his own crew aboard the empty ship to sail it back to port together, only for that second ship, and the sailors placed aboard it, to vanish entirely during the return voyage. It's a genuinely chilling story. It also, according to researchers who have gone looking, appears to have no verifiable original source in any shipping record, newspaper account, or maritime log from the period. Most serious investigators today consider it a much later invention, likely embellished or entirely fabricated well after the fact, with no solid historical footing underneath it at all. One final thread before we close this segment, returning to the most famous case we've discussed tonight. In 1991, a salvage crew searching the waters off Florida discovered the wreckage of 5 Avenger torpedo bombers resting together on the ocean floor, in roughly the area where Flight 19 was believed to have gone down. For a brief, exciting moment, headlines around the world declared the great mystery finally solved. Closer investigation soon revealed a more sobering truth. The tail numbers on the recovered aircraft didn't match any of the 5 planes from Flight 19 at all. What the salvage crew had actually found were the scattered remains of several entirely unrelated training accidents from different years, all resting in the same well-used stretch of ocean, coincidentally arranged in a way that looked, for one brief headline, like the answer everyone had been waiting decades for. It wasn't. Flight 19 itself has never been definitively located, and likely never will be, and the discovery mainly revealed something else entirely. Just how many aircraft, over so many decades of training flights, that patch of ocean has quietly swallowed all on its own. Let's spend this stretch with the cases that actually built the modern legend, the ones journalists were already writing about, years before anyone had settled on the name Bermuda Triangle at all. Within just over a year of each other, two commercial aircraft belonging to British South American Airways vanished in this same general region, under strikingly similar circumstances. In January of 1948, a plane called Star Tiger disappeared while flying from the Azores to Bermuda, with 31 people aboard. No wreckage was ever found. Less than a year later, in January of 1949, a sister aircraft called Star Ariel disappeared on a flight from Bermuda to Jamaica, carrying 20 passengers and crew. Again, despite an extensive search, nothing was ever recovered. Both official investigations at the time concluded that the cause of each loss could not be determined given the available evidence. Two almost identical losses from the same airline within the same year, both genuinely unresolved to this day. These two cases, more than almost any others, are what first drew sustained public and journalistic attention to this stretch of ocean, years before the now famous name existed to describe it. That same year, in December of 1948, a commercial Douglas DC-3 carrying 32 people disappeared during a flight from Puerto Rico to Miami. Despite a large search effort, no wreckage or debris was ever located. The Civil Aeronautics Board's official investigation, much like the British cases before it, concluded that there simply wasn't enough evidence available to determine a specific cause. It's worth understanding exactly what that verdict actually means, since it's often described in retellings as something more dramatic than it technically is. Cause undetermined isn't the same statement as cause unknowable or cause supernatural. It's a formal, careful acknowledgement that an investigation reached the honest limits of what the available evidence could support, an outcome that happens periodically in aviation investigations conducted anywhere in the world, in dangerous open ocean conditions where wreckage may simply never be recovered at all. Not every incident folded into the legend turns out to be quite so mysterious, once you look closely, though. In 1963, two Air Force KC-135 Stratotanker aircraft collided in midair during a routine refueling exercise over the region. Wreckage from both planes was recovered, and a fairly straightforward, though genuinely tragic, explanation was established. A midair collision between two aircraft performing a difficult close proximity maneuver. Despite having actual recovered wreckage and a documented cause, this incident still gets frequently cited in popular retellings of the Bermuda Triangle's mysteries, folded in alongside cases with no wreckage and no clear explanation at all, simply because it happened in the same general stretch of ocean around the same era. It's a useful reminder, worth carrying through the rest of tonight. Proximity to the legend's boundaries doesn't actually make an incident mysterious. Sometimes a solved case just gets swept along anyway, carried by the current of a much larger story. Here's a smaller, more recent case, worth knowing simply because of how quickly everything happened. In December of 1967, a small cabin cruiser called the Witchcraft, carrying two people, set out for a short evening trip near Miami to view the city's Christmas lights from the water. Not long after departing, the captain radioed the Coast Guard, reporting that the boat had struck something submerged, but explaining calmly that they were in no real danger and simply needed a tow back to shore. The Coast Guard dispatched a boat within minutes, reaching the reported location in well under half an hour. They found nothing at all. No wreckage, no debris, no sign of the Witchcraft or her two passengers, in a stretch of water close enough to shore that the city's own lights would have still been visible. It remains one of the more genuinely unsettling cases in this whole legend, less because of any exotic theory attached to it, and more simply because of how little time passed between "we're fine, just need a tow" and complete, unexplained disappearance. Before we close this segment, it's worth pausing on something that applies to nearly every story we've told tonight, and every story still ahead of us. Psychologists have a name for a very ordinary, very human tendency: apophenia, the mind's habit of finding meaningful patterns and connections in events that are, statistically, simply coincidental. A closely related concept, sometimes called illusory clustering, describes how, across a large enough area and a long enough stretch of time, isolated, unrelated incidents will naturally appear to bunch together into a pattern purely by chance, the same way scattered raindrops on a pavement will occasionally seem to form a shape if you stare at them long enough. Consider what this region actually represents statistically. Decades of history. An enormous, heavily trafficked stretch of ocean and sky, crossed by an extraordinary volume of ships and aircraft every single year, sitting directly within one of the most storm-prone, current-swept parts of the entire Atlantic. Given all of that, some number of genuine losses across enough decades was always a statistical certainty. The human mind, presented afterward with a list of these losses, some genuinely strange, many perfectly explainable, a few even fabricated after the fact, has a very natural tendency to draw a line connecting all of them into a single, unified, more compelling story than any one incident could tell on its own. It isn't foolishness. It's simply how minds are built to work. We are pattern-seeking creatures, living in a genuinely patternless universe more often than we'd like to admit. The USS Scorpion, a nuclear submarine, was lost in the Atlantic in 1968, along with all 99 crew members aboard. Unlike many of tonight's stories, this loss was eventually, genuinely resolved. Naval acoustic monitoring stations had recorded unusual underwater sounds around the time of the loss, and a dedicated deep-sea search later located the wreckage. Investigations since have pointed most strongly toward an accidental torpedo malfunction as the likely cause. It sits geographically closer to the Azores than to the commonly drawn triangle boundaries, and it's occasionally mentioned alongside tonight's other stories anyway. But unlike Flight 19, unlike Star Tiger and Star Ariel, this is a case where the ocean eventually patiently did give up its answer. We've spent a good while now with the ships, the aircraft, and the ocean itself. Let's spend this stretch with something a little different. The stranger explanations people have offered over the years, held gently, exactly as claims, alongside whatever evidence actually exists behind each one. One of the most enduring theories traces back to a man named Edgar Cayce, a well-known American psychic active in the early 20th century, sometimes called the sleeping prophet, for the trance-like state he claimed to enter while making his predictions. In the 1930s and 40s, Cayce claimed the lost civilization of Atlantis lay submerged somewhere near the Bahamas, and that ancient crystal-based power sources from that civilization might still be active beneath the waves, periodically disrupting the instruments of ships and aircraft passing overhead. It's a genuinely evocative image. It's worth saying plainly, entirely unsupported by any archaeological or scientific evidence of any kind. A related claim often gets tied to this same story. An underwater rock formation near Bimini, discovered in 1968 and nicknamed the Bimini Road, which some enthusiasts have pointed to as proof of ancient submerged architecture. Geologists who have studied the formation closely describe it instead as beach rock, a naturally occurring formation created by ordinary geological processes. Its strikingly regular, road-like appearance a coincidence of natural fracturing rather than anything built by human or Atlantean hands. A more modern theory comes from a pilot and author named Bruce Jernon, who has described in detail a flight he took in 1970 during which he claims his aircraft entered a strange, tunnel-like formation of clouds he calls electronic fog, during which his instruments briefly failed, and he arrived at his destination considerably faster than should have been physically possible, suggesting to him some kind of genuine time distortion. It remains entirely a personal account. No independent measurement, no corroborating instrument data from any other source, and no scientific body has ever verified the phenomenon Jernon describes. It's a compelling story, told by someone who clearly experienced it as deeply real. It simply hasn't, so far, been demonstrated as anything beyond one person's singular, unverified account. Some of the more elaborate theories connect back to something genuinely real, simply pointed in a different direction than the evidence actually supports. The U.S. Navy operates an actual, acknowledged facility called AUTEC, the Atlantic Undersea Test and Evaluation Center, in the Bahamas, used for legitimate testing of submarines, torpedoes, and other underwater naval technology. Its real, documented secrecy, not unlike the patterns we've discussed in other parts of this series, has fueled entirely separate speculation that the facility might actually be a base for something considerably stranger, extraterrestrial contact, or an underwater alien installation. There's no verified evidence connecting AUTEC to anything beyond its acknowledged mundane purpose. But the pattern should feel familiar by now. Take one real, secretive government facility, and watch how easily an entirely unrelated legend can grow up around it. In 1972, a researcher and writer named Ivan Sanderson proposed something considerably larger in scope than the Bermuda Triangle alone. He described 12 equally spaced locations around the entire globe, which he called vortices, where he claimed unusual disappearances and strange phenomena clustered at unusually high rates, allegedly connected to some unproven aspect of Earth's magnetic field. The Bermuda Triangle was simply one of his 12 proposed points. The theory has never been supported by any verified pattern in actual documented lost data from any of the locations involved, and it remains essentially exactly what it was when first proposed: an intriguing, entirely speculative idea, without confirming evidence behind it. It's worth knowing, too, how this entire legend actually reached the scale of a full cultural phenomenon, because one single book did an enormous amount of that work. In 1974, author Charles Berlitz published a book simply titled The Bermuda Triangle, which went on to sell many millions of copies and became, for an entire generation, most people's primary introduction to the legend. It's a genuinely significant piece of publishing history. It's also been extensively criticized by researchers since, including Larry Kusch, whose own investigative work we discussed earlier, for repeating already debunked exaggerations, presenting settled cases as though they remain mysterious, and generally prioritizing a compelling narrative over the kind of careful verification his subject matter genuinely deserved. A single best-selling book, more than any individual disappearance, may be the single biggest reason this legend grew into the size and shape most people recognize today. The National Ocean Service, part of the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, maintains an official public statement on this exact subject. Their position is straightforward. The majority of disappearances in the region can reasonably be attributed to known, ordinary factors. Severe and often sudden weather, human error, and simply the extraordinary volume of ship and air traffic that passes through the area every single day. They explicitly state that they do not maintain an official record recognizing the Bermuda Triangle as a genuinely hazardous or unusually dangerous area at all. It's the same conclusion Lloyd's of London reached with their insurance data, the same conclusion the Coast Guard has stated in its own records. Whatever mystery remains in tonight's stories, it isn't backed at the official statistical level by any government or scientific body currently studying the region. Rest here for a while. The theories are still out there, floating quietly alongside the wreckage and the weather. None of them need following you into sleep tonight. We're at the halfway point of tonight's journey now. Let's slow down even further here and spend some time with a question we haven't quite asked yet. Not just what happened in these waters, but what's actually changed since. One of the most striking resolutions in this entire legend came, remarkably, less than a decade ago. In 1925, a freighter called the SS Cotopaxi departed from Charleston, South Carolina, bound for Havana, and simply never arrived. No wreckage was found at the time, and the ship became one of the enduring entries on every list of Bermuda Triangle mysteries for the better part of a century. It even found its way into popular culture directly. The 1977 film Close Encounters of the Third Kind included the Cotopaxi among a group of vanished vehicles mysteriously returned, undamaged, by extraterrestrial visitors, cementing its place in the public imagination for an entire new generation. Then, in 2020, a team led by a marine biologist, using historical shipping records and sonar survey data, identified a long-known but previously unattributed shipwreck off the coast of St. Augustine, Florida, as almost certainly the Cotopaxi herself. The most likely cause, based on the wreck's condition and known weather records from the time, was simply a severe storm the aging, overloaded vessel wasn't able to withstand. 95 years after she vanished, one of the legend's most famous ships was quietly finally found. Long before Disappearances became the dominant story told about this region, sailors already had their own reasons to be wary of parts of it, rooted in something considerably less dramatic than any of tonight's other stories. A significant portion of the triangle overlaps with the Sargasso Sea, a vast, calm expanse of open ocean defined not by coastlines but by surrounding ocean currents, and famous for its thick, floating mats of golden brown seaweed. In the age of sail, before engines existed, ships could become genuinely becalmed here for extended stretches, trapped by unusually still, windless air, sometimes for days at a time, running perilously low on food and fresh water, while making no forward progress at all. It's a real, well-documented hazard, considerably more mundane than sea monsters or vanishing compasses, and it likely shaped some of the very earliest fears sailors carried about this stretch of ocean, long before the modern legend took its current shape. Here's a piece of data worth sitting with carefully, because it speaks louder than almost any individual story we've covered tonight. Since the widespread adoption of GPS, satellite communication, and modern radar technology, beginning in the 1970s and accelerating through the following decades, reported disappearances in the region have dropped dramatically. If the Bermuda Triangle held some genuine, active, otherworldly danger, we might reasonably expect that danger to persist regardless of what technology a ship or plane happened to be carrying. Instead, the pattern lines up almost perfectly with a far more grounded explanation. As navigational technology improved and pilots and sailors gained far more reliable tools for knowing exactly where they were at all times, the kind of confused, disoriented losses that characterized so many of tonight's older stories became considerably rarer. That same shift touches directly on something we discussed earlier, too: the region's unusual magnetic declination, where true north and magnetic north align. Modern aircraft and ships rely on a whole suite of navigational tools well beyond a simple magnetic compass. GPS satellites, radar, inertial guidance systems, redundant electronic instruments cross-checking each other constantly. The specific kind of confusion that may have genuinely affected earlier sailors and pilots, unfamiliar with the region's particular quirk, has become almost entirely irrelevant to how vessels actually navigate today. A real historical hazard, quietly rendered almost obsolete by the same steady march of ordinary technological progress. Bermuda itself, interestingly, has taken much the same approach to its own legend that we saw Nevada take with Area 51. Rather than fighting against the association, the island's tourism industry has, at various points over the decades, embraced the mystery as a genuine draw. Souvenir shops, themed tours, and no shortage of local businesses happy to lean into the name that made this small archipelago famous around the world, whatever its accuracy. It's a familiar pattern by now, worth noticing wherever it appears. A frightening legend and a thriving tourism industry, it turns out, get along together just fine. Modern maritime insurance data and cruise line safety statistics consistently describe the region as statistically unremarkable when properly compared against other similarly busy global shipping lanes and flight corridors. Cruise ships cross this exact stretch of ocean by the thousands every single year, carrying millions of passengers, with safety records indistinguishable from routes anywhere else in the world. Whatever this legend still carries emotionally, whatever weight it still holds in the popular imagination, it simply isn't reflected anywhere in the actual, current safety data available to anyone who books a ticket through these waters today. Most of tonight's stories have been about people who never returned at all. This next stretch is about something a little different: the survivors, the near misses, and what their accounts actually tell us once you listen closely to what they said at the time, rather than what got added to their stories later. In 1970, a sailor named Manzo Shinjo survived a genuinely harrowing ordeal after his fishing vessel was struck by a rogue wave in the region, capsizing the boat and leaving him adrift for days before rescue. His own account, given directly afterward, describes a violent, sudden wave and a terrifying fight to stay alive in open water. A real, documented maritime disaster, consistent almost exactly with the kind of rogue wave phenomenon we discussed earlier. It's a valuable case because it shows what an actual survivor's first-hand account of a triangle incident tends to sound like: frightening, dangerous, and entirely explicable, without a hint of anything otherworldly in the original telling. That pattern shows up again and again once you go looking for primary sources instead of later retellings. Pilots who have reported instrument trouble over the years in this region, when interviewed directly and in detail, typically describe conditions consistent with known aviation hazards: sudden, localized turbulence, rapidly forming tropical storm cells that don't always show clearly on older radar systems, or genuine equipment malfunction unrelated to location at all. The dramatic, otherworldly flourishes so often associated with these stories tend to arrive later, added by someone else retelling the account secondhand, sometimes years or even decades after the actual event, each retelling drifting a little further from what the person who actually lived through it originally described. There's a broader research pattern worth knowing about, connected to exactly this tendency. Psychologists who study eyewitness memory have found that dramatic, frightening experiences are especially prone to embellishment with each retelling, particularly once a person learns their experience fits into a larger, already existing legend. It isn't necessarily dishonesty. It's simply how memory works under pressure, gradually reshaping a genuinely frightening night at sea into something that increasingly resembles the famous stories a person has already heard about that same stretch of water. Coast Guard search and rescue logs, which are a matter of public record, tell a quieter, less dramatic version of this same story across the decades. The overwhelming majority of maritime incidents recorded in the region involve entirely ordinary causes. Engine failure, running out of fuel, sudden weather, human error in navigation or judgment, and unfortunately, alcohol involvement in a meaningful percentage of smaller recreational boating incidents. These aren't the stories that get turned into best-selling books. They're simply the actual unglamorous content of most real emergencies at sea, here and in every other ocean on Earth. A genuinely useful comparison point comes from looking at loss rates in similarly trafficked waters elsewhere in the world. The English Channel, one of the busiest shipping lanes on the planet, and the Straits of Malacca, another famously congested passage, both show comparable rates of maritime incident when properly adjusted for traffic volume and weather exposure, without either region ever developing anything close to the same reputation for mystery. It raises a fair question worth sitting with. What made this particular triangle of ocean the one that captured the public imagination so completely, when other equally busy, equally hazardous waters never received the same treatment at all? Part of the answer, most researchers agree, comes back to timing and storytelling rather than anything unique about the water itself. The core cases that built this legend, Flight 19, the Cyclops, Star Tiger, and Star Ariel, arrived in a specific cultural moment, the mid-20th century, when post-war America had a growing appetite for mystery, when magazine and paperback publishing was booming, and when a catchy, ominous name, coined at exactly the right time, could catch hold of the public imagination in a way that a plainer, more accurate description never would have. One further piece of context is worth knowing before we close this segment. Search and rescue technology itself has improved dramatically since most of tonight's oldest stories took place. Modern emergency locator beacons, required on most commercial and many private vessels and aircraft today, transmit a precise satellite-tracked location the instant an emergency occurs, dramatically shrinking search areas and search times compared to what rescuers had available in 1918 or 1945 or even 1970. Many of tonight's oldest, most mysterious losses happened specifically because rescue efforts, however dedicated, were searching enormous stretches of ocean with nothing more than approximate last known coordinates and a great deal of hope. That particular kind of uncertainty, more than almost anything else, has simply become far rarer with each passing decade. Nearly every survivor's account, examined closely at its source, describes something explicable. It's only in the retelling, layered again and again over the years, that the ordinary starts to sound impossible. Some of the most famous names people associate with this legend, it turns out, don't actually belong to it at all. Let's spend this stretch setting a few of those records straight. Amelia Earhart is very possibly the most famous disappearance in aviation history, and she's frequently mentioned in casual conversation about the Bermuda Triangle, sometimes even included in television specials about the region. It's worth correcting plainly. Earhart vanished in July of 1937 over the Central Pacific Ocean, attempting to reach tiny Howland Island during her attempted round-the-world flight, a location many thousands of miles from Bermuda, Florida, or Puerto Rico, on an entirely different ocean altogether. Her disappearance remains a genuine, fascinating historical mystery in its own right, with its own extensive body of research and its own competing theories. It simply has nothing geographically to do with tonight's subject at all, and its frequent inclusion in triangle retellings says more about the legend's gravitational pull on any famous unsolved disappearance than it does about the actual facts of her case. Larry Kush's investigative work, which we discussed a few segments back, is worth revisiting with one specific, concrete example, because it shows exactly how his method actually worked. Charles Berlitz's best-selling book described a yacht called the Connemara 4, found drifting empty in 1955, as a genuinely inexplicable abandonment. No crew, no explanation. Another entry on the growing list of the impossible. Kush went back to the original records and found something considerably more mundane. The Connemara 4 had, in fact, broken free from her moorings during a hurricane that struck the region that same year and drifted, empty and crewless, because no one had ever been aboard her at all during the storm, until she was eventually found. It wasn't a mystery. It was a documented hurricane, and a boat that got loose, precisely the kind of ordinary maritime incident that happens somewhere in the world's oceans during nearly every major storm season. A somewhat different kind of case involves Joshua Slocum, the first person known to have sailed single-handedly around the entire world, an extraordinary achievement he completed in 1898. In 1909, by then an elderly man, Slocum set out on a solo voyage aboard his boat, the Spray, and was never seen again. His disappearance is occasionally folded into triangle lists as well. Maritime historians who've studied the case point out several straightforward, entirely plausible explanations available well before reaching for anything stranger. Slocum was in his 60s, sailing alone, aboard a boat with some documented structural concerns from years of hard use, in an era decades before any kind of distress signal technology existed at all. A single elderly sailor, alone at sea, with no way to call for help if anything went wrong, is tragically explicable without needing the region itself to carry any blame. It's worth returning to the insurance industry one more time, because a specific, real study deserves more detail than we gave it earlier. In 1975, Lloyd's of London conducted an actual internal review covering 2 full decades, from 1955 to 1975, comparing loss rates within the commonly defined triangle boundaries against a control area of similar size and similar shipping traffic elsewhere in the world. The study found no statistically significant difference between the two regions. This wasn't a public relations statement or a casual dismissal. It was the same kind of careful actuarial analysis Lloyd's uses to set real premiums on real policies, and it found, plainly, that the water within the triangle wasn't behaving any differently than comparably busy water anywhere else. The United States Navy has taken a similarly direct position on the record. Official Navy statements have specified that the service does not recognize the Bermuda Triangle as a distinct, defined geographic hazard at all, and attributes the region's documented incidents to the same severe weather patterns, strong currents, and heavy traffic volume we've discussed throughout tonight's journey. It's worth noticing something about who's actually saying this. These aren't skeptical bloggers or casual debunkers. This is the same military branch that lost Flight 19, the same institution with every reason to take seriously any genuine, unusual hazard its own ships and aircraft might face, stating plainly that it doesn't consider this stretch of water to warrant any special classification at all. Given everything we've covered tonight, it's worth pausing on a different kind of question. Why does this legend keep getting retold decade after decade, when so much of the underlying evidence has been available and largely unchanged for so long? Part of the answer sits in the entertainment industry itself. Documentaries, television specials, and popular books about the Bermuda Triangle have continued appearing at a fairly steady pace since the 1970s, largely independent of any actual new evidence emerging. It's a genuinely self-sustaining media economy, in its own way. Mystery sells reliably. Retelling a compelling old story requires far less work than investigating a new one thoroughly, and each new documentary reaches an audience who may never have encountered Cush's careful correction work at all, simply because corrections rarely make for as gripping a television hour as the original claim did. None of this means every question in tonight's journey has a tidy, complete answer. The Carol A. Deering remains genuinely unsolved. Flight 19's wreckage has never been found. What it does mean is that the size and shape of this particular legend, its scale, its staying power, its status as perhaps the most famous unexplained location on Earth, owes a great deal to exactly the pattern we've been tracing across tonight's segments. A handful of genuine, unresolved losses. A much larger number of losses that were never actually mysterious, once someone checked the record carefully. And an enthusiastic, decades-long retelling industry, more interested in keeping the mystery alive than in updating the story to match what's actually been learned since. Here's something worth knowing before we go any further tonight. This particular stretch of the Atlantic isn't even the only ocean on Earth to carry this exact kind of reputation. Off the coast of Japan, in the western Pacific, sailors have long spoken of an area sometimes called the Devil's Sea, or the Dragon's Triangle, where ships and fishing vessels have disappeared over the decades, accompanied by many of the same kinds of stories we've spent tonight walking through. Sudden storms, strange readings, vessels simply gone without a trace. Some Western writers, borrowing the framework that had already proven so successful with Bermuda, began calling it the Bermuda Triangle of the Pacific sometime in the mid-20th century. The pattern should feel familiar by now. A genuinely busy, genuinely storm-prone stretch of ocean, a handful of real losses, and a name dramatic enough to turn ordinary maritime danger into an enduring legend. It happened once in the Atlantic. It happened again, independently, on the other side of the world, using nearly the same narrative formula. Some of the eerier individual reports connected to this whole genre of ocean mystery have a specific, well-understood scientific explanation, worth knowing simply because it's such a striking phenomenon in its own right. For centuries, sailors have reported a strange, glowing blue-white light occasionally appearing at the tips of ship masts during thunderstorms, sometimes accompanied by a faint hissing or crackling sound. It's called St. Elmo's fire, and it isn't ghostly or supernatural at all. It's a real, well-documented form of electrical discharge, created when a strong atmospheric electric field, of the kind found during thunderstorms, ionizes the air around a pointed object like a mast or a wingtip. Pilots have reported the same phenomenon on aircraft, glowing faintly along wing edges during severe weather. It's genuinely beautiful to witness, entirely explicable through basic atmospheric physics, and it's easy to understand how a frightened sailor, centuries before anyone understood atmospheric electricity, might have described the experience in far stranger terms than a modern physicist would. There's a broader category of genuine natural electromagnetic disruption worth knowing about too, one that has nothing specifically to do with this region at all. The sun periodically releases enormous bursts of charged particles, called solar flares, which can trigger geomagnetic storms here on Earth strong enough to measurably disrupt compass readings, radio communications, and even electrical grids on a genuinely global scale. These events aren't unique to the Bermuda Triangle in any way. They affect the entire planet simultaneously when they occur. But it's entirely plausible that some historical incident, somewhere in tonight's long list of stories, coincided with exactly this kind of naturally occurring solar activity, adding one more layer of real, physical, scientifically understood confusion to an already difficult navigational situation. Modern deep-sea exploration technology continues to add new chapters to this story, much the way it did with the SS Cotopaxi a little earlier tonight. Remotely operated vehicles, advanced sonar mapping, and increasingly sophisticated underwater survey techniques are locating historic shipwrecks around the world at a pace earlier generations of researchers could never have managed, and the pattern holding steady across nearly all of these discoveries is a familiar one by now. Once a wreck is actually found and properly examined, the cause is almost always identifiable and almost always mundane. Storm damage, structural failure, human error. The ocean, it turns out, has simply been slow to give up its evidence, not because it's hiding anything extraordinary, but because searching an area this vast, this deep, and this remote has only recently become genuinely practical at scale. It's worth sitting, too, with a purely mathematical way of understanding everything we've covered tonight. Researchers sometimes invoke something called the law of large numbers to explain patterns like this one. The simple statistical principle that, given an enormous enough sample size, rare events are not just possible, but genuinely expected to occur with some regularity, purely by chance, without requiring any unusual underlying cause at all. Consider the numbers involved here one more time. Decades of history, an extraordinarily high volume of ship and aircraft traffic, much of it passing through one of the most storm-prone, current-swept regions on the entire planet. Given all of that, a meaningful number of genuine losses over the decades wasn't some strange anomaly requiring explanation. It was statistically close to guaranteed from the very start. It's worth closing this particular thread by noticing just how many independent voices, working entirely separately from each other over many decades, have all arrived at essentially the same conclusion. Lloyd's of London, examining 20 years of real insurance data. The United States Coast Guard, drawing on its own extensive search and rescue records. The Navy, speaking from direct institutional experience with several of tonight's most famous losses. NOAA's National Ocean Service, drawing on broader oceanographic and meteorological data. Modern skeptical research organizations, which have spent decades specifically reviewing paranormal and unexplained claims of every kind, reaching the same conclusion after their own independent investigations. None of these institutions were working together. None of them had any particular reason to agree with each other, beyond simply looking honestly at the same available evidence. And yet, again and again, from entirely different angles and entirely different institutional perspectives, the answer keeps landing in the same place. That kind of convergence across so many unrelated sources tends to mean something. Not that every question has been answered. We've spent tonight sitting honestly with several that haven't been, and won't pretend otherwise now. But when insurers, the military, government scientists, and independent researchers all look at the same water and arrive at the same unremarkable conclusion, it's worth taking that agreement seriously, at least as seriously as the far louder, far more dramatic version of the story that's been retold in bookstores and documentaries for the last 50 years. We're nearing the end of tonight's journey now. Before we close, it's worth spending some time with why the ocean itself has always been such fertile ground for mystery, long before this particular stretch of it ever got a name. Here's a genuinely striking comparison, worth sitting with for a moment. More is currently known in precise detail about the surface of Mars than about the floor of Earth's own oceans. The overwhelming majority of the seafloor remains unmapped at any meaningful resolution. Even now, in an age of satellites and remote sensing technology capable of photographing distant planets in remarkable detail. It's a genuinely humbling thought. The deepest, darkest parts of our own planet remain, in a very real sense, less explored than another world entirely. Against that backdrop, it becomes a little easier to understand why the ocean, any ocean, has always been such an especially rich home for mystery and legend. We simply haven't finished looking yet, and human imagination has never been shy about filling in the gaps left by genuine, ongoing uncertainty. Here's another specific case worth examining closely, in the same spirit as the Connemara 4 story from a little earlier. A Japanese cargo ship called the Raifoku Maru sank in the region in 1925, and popular retellings, including Berlitz's influential book, describe a chilling, garbled distress call sent just before she went down. Something translated dramatically as, "Danger like a dagger now, come quick." It became one of the more frequently repeated, most atmospheric details in the entire legend. Larry Kush's research found a considerably more mundane story underneath the dramatic phrasing. The ship went down during a documented severe storm, and the famous quote appears to have emerged from a garbled, imprecise translation of an already difficult radio transmission, embellished further with each retelling over the following decades until it read like something from a horror story rather than a distressed sailor's desperate, storm-battered attempt to communicate his position. It's a pattern we've seen again and again tonight. Take a real, tragic, entirely explicable maritime disaster, and let 50 years of retelling slowly sand away the mundane details until only the eeriest fragments remain. There's a genuinely useful modern legacy that's grown out of this legend, worth knowing about before we close. Flight 19 specifically has become a standard case study in general aviation training programs, used to teach student pilots about the real, serious dangers of instrument confusion, disorientation over featureless open water, and the critical importance of maintaining careful situational awareness rather than relying on a single, potentially faulty instrument. Whatever else this legend has become, it has also quietly made modern pilots somewhat safer by keeping a vivid, memorable cautionary tale in circulation long after the original tragedy itself has faded from living memory. It's worth pausing on just how different searching for something lost at sea looks today compared to 1945. When Flight 19 vanished, searchers had visual scanning from other aircraft and ships, and little else. No satellite tracking, no sonar mapping of the seafloor, no deep-sea remote vehicles capable of examining wreckage miles beneath the surface. Today's search and rescue operations draw on satellite-based emergency locator beacons, providing precise coordinates within moments of an emergency, sonar capable of mapping the ocean floor in remarkable detail, and remotely operated vehicles able to explore depths no human diver could ever safely reach. The gap between those two eras isn't small. It's the difference between searching an entire ocean with a handful of pilots' eyes and searching it with instruments precise enough to locate a single object the size of a car, miles beneath the surface, in genuine detail. Perhaps the most grounding perspective of all comes from the people who actually cross this water for a living, today, routinely, without a second thought. Commercial pilots who fly the Miami to Bermuda corridor regularly, container ship crews who pass through these exact coordinates as a matter of ordinary weekly business, cruise ship captains who've crossed this stretch of ocean hundreds of times over entire careers. When asked directly about the supposed dangers of the Bermuda Triangle, consistently described the crossing as thoroughly unremarkable, indistinguishable from any other comparable stretch of open ocean they navigate regularly. For the people who actually know this water best, through years of direct, ordinary professional experience, it simply isn't treated as anything special at all. The mystery, for them, exists almost entirely in other people's imaginations, not in their own working lives. By now, across tonight's whole journey, a clear pattern has emerged, one worth holding on to as we head toward our final stretch together. Some of tonight's stories were genuinely, honestly unsolved. The Carol A. Deering Flight 19's exact wreckage, a small handful of cases that may simply never be fully explained. Many more turned out, on close examination, to have been solved all along. Their mystery constructed entirely out of exaggeration, mistranslation, and decades of enthusiastic retelling, rather than out of any genuine gap in the evidence. And a few, like the Ellen Austin, may never have happened in the form most people know them at all. Three very different categories of story, all folded together under a single dramatic name, coined in 1964, that made all three sound like exactly the same kind of mystery, even though they were never really that at all. Let's spend this stretch with what this whole legend actually turned into, beyond the ships and the aircraft themselves. The phrase Bermuda Triangle has drifted so far into everyday English that it barely needs the ocean at all anymore. People casually describe the back of a junk drawer, a chronically disorganized desk, or the mysterious place where a single sock disappears every laundry cycle as its own personal Bermuda Triangle. A small, affectionate, thoroughly domesticated version of a legend that once described genuine tragedy at sea. It's a strange kind of afterlife for a name born out of real loss. But it says something true about how completely this particular story worked its way into the culture. Very few historical mysteries earn their own permanent shorthand for things that vanish inexplicably. This one did. And it wasn't the last of its kind, either. Following Bermuda's example, a number of other mystery triangles have been proposed around the world over the decades, each borrowing the same basic formula: a defined stretch of water or land, a handful of genuine losses, and a dramatic name to tie them together. The Great Lakes region has its own version, sometimes called the Michigan Triangle, associated with a cluster of shipping losses on Lake Michigan. We've already mentioned Japan's Devil's Sea. And later in this series, we'll spend a night walking the edge of another one considerably closer to home for many of us. The Alaska Triangle, where a genuinely enormous, sparsely populated wilderness has generated its own long list of disappearances and its own decades of speculation. The formula, it turns out, travels well wherever a large enough stretch of genuinely dangerous, genuinely remote territory meets a storyteller willing to give it a name. It's worth spending a moment on something a little more reflective before we close, because it touches on why a show like this one exists at all. There's something genuinely comforting, in its own particular way, about sitting with an unsolved mystery rather than demanding it resolve immediately. Not every open question is a source of anxiety. Some of them are simply proof that the world remains larger, older, and more textured than any single explanation could ever fully capture. A reminder that curiosity doesn't require an ending to be worthwhile. The Carol A. Deering may never be explained. Flight 19's wreckage may never be found. And that's all right. A mystery held gently, without needing to be solved before you can rest, is a very different thing from a fear that keeps you awake. It's worth closing with a broader look at how much safer this exact kind of journey has become since most of tonight's oldest stories took place, because the improvement runs well beyond any one training program or any one piece of technology. Over the course of the 20th century, aviation and maritime safety regulations advanced enormously. Mandatory life-saving equipment, standardized radio communication requirements, dramatically improved weather forecasting supported by satellite imagery that simply didn't exist when the Cyclops or Flight 19 vanished. Taken together, these changes have made the specific combination of circumstances behind so many of tonight's oldest disappearances. Sudden weather with no warning, no way to call for help, searchers with nothing but their own eyes to work with. Genuinely rare today, in the Bermuda Triangle and everywhere else ships and aircraft travel. There's a distinction worth naming plainly, one final time, before we close this segment. There's a real difference between a genuine mystery and a manufactured one, and it's worth learning to tell them apart. Here and anywhere else this kind of story gets told. A genuine mystery involves real people, real families left without answers, and real, honest uncertainty that careful investigation simply hasn't been able to resolve, however much effort has gone into trying. A manufactured mystery is built instead from exaggeration, omitted context, and the quiet erosion of accuracy that happens every time a story gets retold by someone more interested in the telling than the truth. Both kinds of mystery can hold real emotional weight. Only one of them actually deserves to keep you wondering. Even now, this story isn't entirely finished being written. Maritime archaeologists and wreck hunting researchers continue actively searching for several of tonight's still unresolved losses, using exactly the kind of modern sonar and deep-sea technology we discussed a little earlier. It's entirely possible that within our lifetimes, another piece of this puzzle, Flight 19's wreckage, or some further detail about the Deering's crew, will finally surface the same slow, patient way the Cotopaxi's story finally resolved after 95 years of waiting. The water hasn't finished telling this story yet. It's simply still taking its time. We've come a long way across this water together tonight. Let's spend our final stretch gathering everything we've found along the way, and then we'll head back toward shore. We began at the edge of an undefined triangle, a shape with no official boundary at all, connecting Miami, Bermuda, and Puerto Rico across 500,000 square miles of some of the busiest ocean on Earth. We met the USS Cyclops, lost in 1918, and her two sister ships, lost decades later under circumstances that pointed toward a shared design flaw rather than anything stranger. We spent real time with Flight 19, the single most famous case in this entire legend, and learned that the Navy's own investigation had identified plausible causes for both the flight's disappearance and the loss of the search plane sent after it, even if the wreckage itself was never recovered. We met Larry Kusch, the librarian who spent years tracking exaggerations back to their original sources and found again and again storms quietly omitted, wreckage quietly unmentioned, and dramatic quotes that turned out to be mistranslations dressed up over decades of retelling. We met the Mary Celeste, found far from these waters despite everyone insisting otherwise. We watched the SS Cotopaxi finally get identified in 2020, 95 years after she vanished, closing one of the legend's oldest open chapters just a few short years ago. We spent time with the science, too. The Gulf Stream's speed, the very real rogue wave science once doubted, the magnetic declination that genuinely could confuse an unprepared navigator, the Sargasso Sea's ancient reputation for becoming sailing ships long before anyone spoke of disappearances at all. We heard from Lloyd's of London, the Coast Guard, the Navy, and NOAA, each independently reaching the same unremarkable conclusion about the water's actual danger. And we sat, honestly, with a handful of cases that still don't have a clean answer. The Carol A. Deering, chief among them, because pretending every mystery resolves neatly wouldn't have been honest either. What emerges across all of it isn't really a story about a cursed triangle of ocean at all. It's a story about how easily a name, coined at just the right cultural moment, can gather up decades of separate, unrelated events. Some genuinely strange, most perfectly explicable, a few possibly invented outright, and stitch them into something that feels, from a distance, like a single unified mystery. The water itself was never the dangerous part. The story we told about it, retold and embellished for 60 years running, turned out to be considerably more powerful than anything actually happening beneath the waves. That doesn't make tonight's journey any less worth taking. Real people were genuinely lost in these waters. The crews of the Cyclops, of Flight 19, of the Deering, of the Witchcraft. Their families waited for answers that mostly never came, and some of those answers still haven't arrived even now. Holding that truth alongside the more skeptical parts of tonight's journey isn't a contradiction. It's simply what an honest telling of this story actually requires: genuine loss, genuine mystery in a few remaining cases, and a genuinely enormous amount of embellishment layered on top of both, until it became difficult to tell, from the outside, which parts of the legend belong to which category at all. Millions of people cross this exact stretch of ocean every single year now, by plane and by ship, and the overwhelming majority of them arrive exactly where they intended to go, without incident, without a second thought about the name printed on old paperback covers from the 1970s. The water is still out there tonight, doing exactly what it has always done. Carrying ships, generating storms, occasionally, rarely, tragically claiming one it shouldn't have, the same way every ocean on Earth occasionally does. If you're still listening, drifting somewhere between waking and sleep, that's exactly where this story was always meant to leave you. Not frightened, but genuinely curious, the way a good mystery ought to leave you, whether or not it ever fully resolves. There are other waters and other stretches of wild, remote land, still waiting for their own night. Somewhere north, across the vast, empty stretches of Alaska, a similar pattern has quietly repeated itself for decades. Hikers, small planes, and entire hunting parties disappearing into terrain so enormous it may simply be the whole explanation on its own. We'll walk the edge of what's become known as the Alaska Triangle together soon, and see how much of it is genuine mystery, and how much is simply the honest, ordinary danger of a landscape too large to fully search. And somewhere beyond that, we'll spend a night with an even larger question than any single stretch of water or wilderness could hold: whether anyone else is out there in the universe at all, and what it would actually take to know for certain. You don't have to remember any of it tonight. That's what tomorrow night is for. This has been the Sleepy Scholar. Sleep well.